Session 2 is about initiatives and ways forward in Europe. Initiative in Germany and Sweden will be shared, and there will be a Q&A session after the two presentations. Let me introduce the presenters. Dr. Karl Sörenson, Director of Research and Deputy Director of the Strategy and Policy Department at the Swedish Defense Research Agency, and Dr. Joseph Verbovszky, Co-Director, German Wargaming Center, Helmut, Schmidt University. And the facilitator is Mr. HARADA, Senior Fellow, Policy Simulation Division, NIDS. Thank you. I am HARADA from the Policy Simulation Divisions, NIDS. So now we open the session 2. In session 2, we learn about initiatives in Europe. At the Policy Simulation Divisions, we have hosted the Connections Japan International Conference several times, but in the past, in many cases, we focused on the United States or the United Kingdom to learn about their policy simulation efforts and initiatives. But the question is, what kind of policy simulation or wargaming is being conducted in other countries? We'd like to learn from other countries' examples, and with that intent, the session 2 is dedicated to the initiatives in Europe, in particular Germany and Sweden. We have invited two experts. What specific simulations have been conducted in Germany and Sweden, what they do specifically, and the historical background as well. Then after the presentations, just like session 1, there will be a Q&A time. Participants online can also send your question in the chat box. So let me first introduce the two presenters very briefly. The first presenter is Dr. Joseph Verbovszky. Dr. Verbovszky is the co-director of the German Wargaming Center at Helmut Schmidt University, and he specializes in international relations. The Fall and Rise of German Wargaming is the title of his today's presentation. And specifically, he will talk about the resurgence of wargaming in Germany in recent years. Then the second presentation will be by Dr. Karl Sörenson. He is at FOI, or Swedish Defense Research Agency, and he is the Director of Research and also Deputy Director of the Strategy and Policy Department at FOI. And he specializes in deterrence and game theory. Today's topic is war games and game theory. So it discusses about the link between game theory and the deterrence and war game, and also he will share the examples at FOI. Now I'd like to call Dr. Verbovszky to give presentation. Doctor, you have the floor.
First, I would like to say thank you to the NIDS for the invitation. I'm extremely honored to be here, and proud to be able to present our efforts in Germany and to say that we are, in fact, returning to a tradition that we have long neglected. So I'm going to start with the presentation. So this is a small roadmap of what we're going to be discussing today. I have a small summary, then I will go into the history of wargaming as a strategic asset before World War II, and then look at wargaming as an indicator of strategic culture after the war and up to 2023 and beyond. And then I will talk about how wargaming has returned now to Germany and what this might imply for the future. So, who are we? So we are the German Wargaming Center. We are located at the Chair for Political Theory at the Helmut Schmidt University, or the University of the Armed Forces in Hamburg. Our mission is to enhance what we call strategic awareness among civilian and military decision makers, both at the national and subnational levels. We do this because we are a federal state, so many of the threats we're facing have to be handled not only at the national level, but also at the state and local level, and this all plays into national resilience. So that's why we have this focus. And we design and we facilitate our own war games. and we use wargaming as a research method in international relations. So our focus is at the strategic level. So we cooperate with the Bundeswehr, who does operational and tactical level. The Staff College also works on the strategic level, and we focus mostly on interagency cooperation and a whole-of-government approach. So those are my two colleagues, my co-director, Dr. Philipp Schäfer, and our project manager, who started in September, Xenia Schröder. So, a small summary or history of German wargaming. Prior to World War II, wargaming is considered a strategic asset in Germany. Go into that in a second. During the Federal Republic, so since 1949, wargaming is instead more of an indicator of and reflection of strategic culture. So by looking at wargaming, we can see sort of an example of how the strategic culture of Germany impacts its international relations or security policy in this case. So to illustrate this, we enhanced historical analysis with actually an analysis I did myself, which is what I call German structural pacifism. It's actually a book, and it's about German security policy after the founding of the German Federal Republic. So our argument is that wargaming did not disappear after World War II, but it atrophied from 1960 to 2023. So it was in some ways neglected. In some ways it was used, but only in a very tactical sense. It did not really reach the level that it had prior to the war. So we divided this analysis into 4 parts. And those are what I'm going to discuss today. A tactical revival in 1960, the outsourcing, so the loss of the indigenous capability and move toward an allied-based interoperable wargaming with the US, finally the decline, and then the resurgence. So prior to World War II, wargaming in Germany is a strategic asset. There's a quote here from Marc Bloch, who is a French officer who gives testimony in 1940. The most important part of this, I would say there's 2 important parts actually. So at the bottom of this quote, there is the phrase, "The German triumph was essentially a triumph of intellect." So this highlights the importance of wargaming in allowing Germany to create new concepts of warfare during the 1920s and into the 1930s, even though they did not possess some of the weapon systems, for example. So there were restrictions on tanks, U-boats, and airplanes, but they were still able to create concepts for how to fight with these machines, even though they did not possess them. So this is actually quite interesting. However, what we find is that today we're probably closer to the first part of the quote, which is what drove our armies to disaster was the cumulative effect of a great number of different mistakes. One glaring characteristic was common to all of them. Our leaders, or those who acted for them, were incapable of thinking in terms of a new war. So that is sort of the problem we now face. And so wargaming is something we're trying to bring in order to re-enhance Germany's strategic imagination. So this is a little bit about the history. Probably the most important point has already been made about wargaming used to create new concepts. So, German security policy post-1945. So, starting in 1949, the German Federal Republic defines its identity in opposition to its own authoritarian past. It has a formula of never again war, never again alone, and never again Auschwitz as sort of a orienting point. Germany is peaceful, cooperative, and responsible. And this is used to great success during the Cold War in order to rejoin the community of nations. However, after reunification, this becomes problematic. This is what I call structural pacifism. Our current Berlin Republic, when the capital was moved to Berlin in 1990, it still runs on Bonn software, which means that it's using the same kind of policy that was happening during the Cold War, but it's not appropriate for the current context. And so what we end up with is a symbolic confrontation with the past being consistently prioritized over military effectiveness. So I wrote a very long analysis of this, and I can see this also in the case of wargaming, and so that's what we investigate. So tactical revival in the Federal Republic from 1960 to 1967. Wargaming does return to Germany after World War II, but it's with very severe restraints. The first war games are carried out only 15 years after the end of World War II, so there's already quite a time lag. And it's driven primarily by former mid-level Wehrmacht officers who are familiar with the practice. The reason for this is because the Bundeswehr does need to practice tactical and operational procedures, but they lack sort of a capability, so this is why wargaming is brought back. However, it's restricted. They use the word Planspiel, which is a sort of planned game instead of war games or Kriegsspiele, and it underscores the view that the military and wargaming are viewed as necessary evil, which are part of NATO defense, but not a tool of national politics. And wargaming at the strategic level is restricted. In fact, after a wargaming which looked into the strategic role of the Navy, it was called Hamlet, the Chief of Defense actually said, this is not a question that the Army or the Navy should be engaging with. So that was the end of definite end of strategic wargaming there. And then in the 1960s and 70s up to the 90s, what we have is the outsourcing of wargaming. So wargaming as a distinctive German methodology disappears, and it becomes a part of joint US-German military operations research. And the main point here is to remain interoperable with the US. So this is another change. Finally, we have the decline of German wargaming from 1990 to 2023. German wargaming becomes a victim of structural pacifism. Germany increases the number of military missions abroad during this time. However, it reduces its gaming capability. There is a wonderful quote from Melan Vego in his paper from 2012 on the topic, and he says, the last thing that should be defunded is wargaming, and that's more or less the first thing the Germans do in 1990 is they defund wargaming. They lose their in-house operations research capability, and although wargaming is rediscovered as an educational tool, it never really takes off as a serious discipline. So what we have in 2023 is essentially individuals throughout Germany who have some knowledge but no institutionalization. And that's kind of where we start from with the resurgence. There's three major drivers of change which allow German wargaming or make the need for it apparent. Number one is there's a shifting political discourse on security policy. So the three lessons, never again war, never again alone, and never again Auschwitz, are no longer really able to explain things like Zeitenwende, which means a change of the times, or Kriegstüchtigkeit, which means to be capable of fighting. This creates sort of a space within the discourse for initiatives to come up with potential solutions. So in comparison to the 1960s, the military leadership actually supports wargaming. So we have a wargaming handbook which was written in 2024, and that actually is signed by the Chief of Defense. So this is already a signal of support. In about a week, we will have a public wargaming podcast, which is modeled somewhat on the Sky News podcast in the UK. However, we did not script read. So this is a very honest outcome, and it's going to be quite interesting. But this is just showing that wargaming, which previously would never have been considered in the public eye, is now a fairly acceptable topic. Second, there's NATO's wargaming initiative, which put pressure on Germany to actually engage with wargaming again, to also be interoperable with NATO concepts. And then finally, the decreasing US joint training opportunities under the current US administration, they are putting an additional fire under the Germans to develop their own concepts. So not only to be part of the alliance, but to also be looking at, okay, how do we bring ourselves into this? How do we create new concepts? So where we're at right now is moving from what a friend of mine calls a grassroots insurgency. This is meant ironically, but essentially a group of mid-level officers and scientists to turn this into an institutionalized format which can train future generations. Wargaming is supported by scientific research. This is what we do. And it's spread across a network of institutions. So rather than having one centralized wargaming entity, we have multiple different structures, which do educational wargaming, analytical wargaming, wargaming research, and so forth. So this actually creates a much more resilience in the way we're building it up. One of the, probably the most important new element is that we are focusing on strategic wargaming, which hasn't been done since 1927 in a real capacity. And our current security policy is extremely short-term and reactive. So in the 1990s, strategic wargaming was actually forbidden in the MOD for appearing escalatory, and we wanted to not show that we have prudent planning because that could be threatening to others. So the focus on strategic wargaming is a major break with the past, and it demonstrates what we consider an intellectual response to the Zeitenwende, so a response to the change of the times in looking at modern conflicts and what they entail. So our philosophy involves that modern conflicts not only require combined arms, but also combined deployment of all resources of national and international power. So what international formats do we sit in, and how do we leverage them as well? So looking at this, interagency wargaming becomes extremely important, as does the democratization of strategic thinking. So we need to get, as part of national resilience, people, so citizens, also companies, organizations need to think strategically, because this needs to be combined as a sort of form of national power so that we can act. On this note, we recently signed a cooperation framework with the Planning Office and the Armed Forces Office, which is responsible for the Staff College, to work on net assessment and using wargaming as a strategic capability in the MOD. So, here are some examples of German wargames. I'm not going to go into this too much, but if we look, Entanglement, Hydra, Commander Sisu, and Neustadt, as well as Cohesion focus on the strategic level. A lot of the new German wargames are focusing on command, coordination, communication, but also hybrid threats or strategic challenges. So this is really what we see that there's definitely a focus here coming out of these 8 different games. So this is the summary and the outlook. Wargaming is a strong indicator of Germany's strategic culture. Looking at wargaming can give us an idea of how Germany has done security policy in the past 75 years. And we talk about atrophy and how we're ending that. And so, yes, the resurgence of German wargaming marks an intellectual Zeitenwende and will enable, hopefully, a mentality change among not only the MOD, but also other ministries, the parliament possibly, as well as, other organizations that move into the civilian area and also economic area, which should then allow us to rebuild our strategic thinking in Germany, which is ultimately our goal. So, thank you very, very much for your attention, and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Dr. Verbovszky. Now let's move on to the next speaker, Dr. Sörenson. Dr. Sörenson, you have the floor.
So, thank you, HARADA, and thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for being here, and thank you, NIDS, for this wonderful opportunity to talk a little bit about wargaming and how this sort of nowadays worldwide community is starting to discuss more together on how to conduct and understand wargames. So I thought I would start to say a couple of words about the Swedish Defense Research Agency, because it's perhaps an entity that's not that known to all of you in the room. Basically, as you can see here, this is what they use. It's the torch. The torch is also on our heraldic shield of the Swedish Armed Forces, and the Swedish Defense Research Agency has the torch to show that we're supposed to bring enlightenment to the defense community. I don't know if I'm going to be able to convince you of that after my presentation, but that's at least the general idea. So how do we do that? Well, some brief facts. We're about an agency of 1,800 people, around 1,200 researchers, and of those, around 40% hold PhDs. We're located in 4 places in Sweden, up in the north in Umeå, where we have our CBRN laboratories. In Stockholm, Kista, where we have the headquarters and where I work from. We have Grindsjön, south of Stockholm, where we conduct explosive testing. And Linköping, where we do electronic warfare and aviation. So here are just an example of our sort of major research fields, and as you see, it sort of spans several things. FOI has, over the last 5-10 years, been increasing its numbers in lockstep with the armed forces and other parts of the Swedish defense establishments. I belong to sort of what you would call operational analysis and strategic planning part, but I also do security policy, of course. So what I'm doing most of my days is to run the Swedish Defense Research Agency's nuclear weapons analysis project. It's a project that draws on several parts of FOI's expertise, and we'd like to think of it in sort of 3 main areas. It's with the weapons technology, sort of nuclear weapons effects, threats and protection, yield physics, carriers and systems. This is mostly done within our CBRN division. We do behavior, sort of operations analysis, deterrence modeling, strategic wargaming. This is where I come from. And we do nuclear weapons strategy and policy, which is strategic analysis, nuclear weapons status, counter-analysis, arms control. And I think the idea is that nuclear weapons are such complicated instruments of power and weapons that you need to have several types of expertise. You cannot only rely on a couple of political scientists or a couple of theoretical physicists or a couple of engineers who are great at ballistics, but rather you need to combine all of these communities to understand how the weapons function. And once you have the weapon, what does this enable in terms of behavior? Once you have figured that out, every country that has a nuclear weapon, they go from having the weapon, a potential behavior, to a strategy and a doctrine. And the doctrine sort of delimits the way they want to act with their weapons. So to understand all of these things, so for instance, if you want to understand a doctrine of a nuclear state, you need to understand what type of weapon systems do they actually have, what type of behavior does this weapon enable the country to actually potentially use, and finally, what type of a policy did they decide for in the doctrine. And I think it's been quite useful for us, and it's also, in a sense, a cost-effective way of working to quickly be able to get analysis up and running, and especially now with today's quickly changing strategic and security environment, it's important to be able to merge various parts of research and analysis to quickly help decision makers, both within our military but also within our government and cabinet structure, to get a sense of what's going on. So we do this also then by employing different types of methodology, and I think this is perhaps where it becomes more interesting for this community. We of course do sort of classic standard research. We look into sort of the history of a country and how it has developed its interest and how it's working with nuclear weapons and security policy. But we also do wargaming, and wargaming is what I'm going to be talking to you about today. I'm not a great wargamer. I'm interested in the same sense that a lot of people with a similar background to mine, and I'm a sort of a game theorist. I did my PhD on deterrence and game theory. There is an overlap, and I'm curious about where this overlap actually, what it consists of, and if they can inform each other, these 3 fields. So deterrence, game theory, and wargaming. So this is what I will be talking to you about today. So, as I said, war games, and game theory. So I thought I'd start by discussing a little bit about the connection between war games and deterrence, a little bit about the connection between game theory and deterrence, and then a deterrence war game that we did at FOI with game theoretical aspects, i.e. sort of how can we merge these fields and what can we learn, what can we improve. And I hope you bear with me, because this is not sort of a finished well-curated research that I'm going to present to you. It's a sort of a data mining thing that we did to see what was there. But given the amount of work we're currently laboring under because of the war in Ukraine, the heightening tensions, well, basically around all parts of the globe, it's been very difficult for us to do proper systematic research. This was sort of, if I, in a parallel universe, I would be in here today and present a really well thought out research project that had been sort of concluded and presented in a scientific newspaper. But that's not what I'm going to do today. I'm going to offer this to you as thoughts, and then hopefully we can sort of take it from there as a community. So, to understand what happens in a nuclear deterrence situation, it is inherently difficult because we miss empirical data for the outcome of conflict. So we need to understand the dynamics of nuclear deterrence. So how can we do that? I mean, we can look, of course, on all the times where a nuclear power threatened a non-nuclear power, if those threats were effective, if the opponent yielded to the pressure, or if it stood firm. We could see if they continued to be in a status quo, but we miss the outcome of conflict, i.e. when deterrence fails and there's a nuclear exchange. We're all very happy for this, I'm sure, but it makes it more difficult for us as policy advisors to give actual good advice to our decision makers. So one way of gaining insight to the dynamics of a deterrence situation, especially a nuclear deterrence situation, is by playing war games. And as you're all aware, I think there's a different type of semantics when it pertains to war games. Some use various words, but I would say that, well, at least we use the distinction of pedagogic war games and analytical war games, where pedagogic war games is when you bring a community together, you play the game, and it's of interest to see what happens, but especially it is an important experience for the ones playing the game. They learn insights that are important. It's a quick way to bring people up to speed about the special dynamics that pertain to nuclear deterrence. Analytical war games are also very interesting from this perspective because we can sort of then play a game several times, and I think this was very interesting in the previous presentation about how we could sort of generate many plays of the same scenario with only tweaking various variables to see what the different outcomes are and what type of equilibria that would yield. So I'm happy to talk more about this in a couple of minutes. Regardless, anyone who played a war game, if you've been into that situation, you've been in the room, a lot of the time what you're talking about is, of course, what you're going to do, but also what is the opponent going to do if I do what we're planning to do. So this is sort of this is something you spend a lot of time on, and that's basically trying to anticipate your adversary's next move. We know this from board games, we know this from many types of games. A different way to understand nuclear deterrence is to understand it through scientific modeling. This is the field I come from, and just as war games and deterrence always has had a sort of special relationship in that this is something that we need to use. Game theory was for a long time thought of as an important and robust way of trying to gaining insight to the same type of dynamics that we talked about before, the strategic interaction in a nuclear deterrence situation. And if you go into the history, which I will not really do, but game theory and deterrence theory actually developed in tandem, because deterrence theorists and game theorists realized that there were things within game theory that game theory couldn't explain. So this is a scientific problem for game theory when you try to do deterrence. Vice versa, game theory could shed insight to certain aspects of deterrence dynamics that deterrence theorists had difficulties understanding on their own. And I think you could say this, it was for a long time a very, very fruitful connection, so that I think there's at least 2 Nobel Prizes in economics that's gone to deterrence theorists who are also game theorists. So Reinhard Selten is the first one, who presented the deterrence paradox. And the second one is, of course, Schelling and especially his book, Strategy of Conflict. Anyway, game theory is a good way of sort of really precisely trying to sort of spell out what are the preferences for the actors, what are the probabilities, what are the key concepts. Rationality plays a huge role here, and this is also a word that's contested. Are we rational? Do we play rationally? Do you consider yourself to be rational? This is something that, at least if there's a couple of political scientists in the room, this usually sparks debate automatically. So an important solution concept in game theory is what we call the Nash equilibrium, and that sort of a very, very, very rough definition of that is when both players play the best response strategy to the other's strategy. So basically, no one can switch strategy and make an improvement. So when you play your optimal strategy and the opponent plays its optimal strategy, that's when you're in a Nash equilibrium. So then the question is, this is not unlike what we actually do in war games. We do sequence, we have a challenger, you have a defender, you have outcomes, you think about your opponent's next move, the opponent thinking about your next move. So is there insights to be gained from game theory in wargaming, a deterrence situation? So FY tested a wargame, a nuclear deterrence signaling game, we called it. It focused on the High North. I'm not going to go into detail about the scenario of the actual game, but basically it was sort of red versus blue. Red made an incursion into blue territory and signaled that it would willing to use nuclear weapons, and blue would have to sort of signal back what it wanted. And we played for 4 terms. In each team there was 4 to 5 players, and what we did to try to sort of data mine this a little bit, the questions weren't great, the answers were difficult to us to interpret, as you will see, but what we did ask them was, what do you think your opponent's going to do next turn? Do you think you escalated the situation? Do you think you increased the probability for a nuclear confrontation, i.e. someone using nuclear weapons? Do you think you de-escalated the situation? And each team member had to appraise the probability with a number between 0 and 100 for questions 2 to 4. Question 1 was a qualitative assessment by each team. And then what we did was that we interpreted the qualitative answers in question 1, and if they in general made a prediction that turned out to be right, we gave them 1, and then we deducted points if they had minor things wrong, like they did basically do the maneuver you predicted, but they didn't use land forces, they used only naval and air force assets, for instance. Then you deducted some points for that. Conversely, if they had, if they made basically did not manage to appraise or predict the next move, they got 0. But if they had made some minor right predictions, you got some point from that. So what we can see from this is that basically when they played, they were good at predicting the opponent's play for 3 out of 4 terms. They weren't perfect, but they did a good job. However, so what you could say is they played then best reply to each other, so they were in a Nash equilibrium, both optimized in a way that was reasonable. However, at one point, they started to misunderstand each other. And it's this misunderstanding that it sort of, the players lost control and the game went into nuclear confrontation. So we didn't have a purpose with the game to see if we wanted to see if there would be nuclear confrontation. We just wanted to see how it unfolded. So questions 2 and 4 are sort of similar in this respect. You can basically see where they start to misunderstand each other. So both blue and red are sort of predicting in a similar way. They have different ideas of what actually de-escalate means, but they start to misunderstand each other what's going to happen around turn 3, so S3. And this is when we came to nuclear confrontation. So we can also sort of map that it's actually kind of a big difference between the players when they answer the question sheet individually, and then we ask them to answer them as a team. And then afterwards, we also calculated the average from the individual responses, and we compared it to the weighted response that they made as a team. You can see it's quite different from when you just add up and divide what they said individually to what they actually said as a team. And I think that's sort of also, it's not here sort of, you can't say who was right in the predictions or how they view the situation, but it's clear that the group dynamics plays a huge role in war games. And that's maybe something to be mindful of tomorrow. So we also did basically what you can call a Breyer score test. It means basically you calculate how well they managed to predict. And it's actually wrong here. Red was better than blue in predicting the play, but as you can see, chance or sort of random play actually did a better job of predicting than any of the players. So that's discouraging in a way, but maybe that's also sort of way to convince people to give us more money, to do more research on this, so we all become better at predictions. So a few remarks then. We can sort of, players behave rationally most of the time. I either stick to the preferences order and the play best response, but they do misunderstand each other. And when that happens, that seems to be the danger also of the games. Sorry, we play this. Do you hear me still? Oh, all right. So, so the misunderstandings are in a sense dangerous, because that's when things starts to unfold and escalation becomes uncontrollable. Are they rational? Yeah, we already talked a little bit about that. They sort of are, but the misunderstandings makes them play off equilibrium path. I'm not going to go into this, but you can sort of try to, you could possibly also go down an avenue where you try to understand this. What I mentioned now is sort of classical game theory, where people are rational. We could use an alternative models like prospect theory or level K or some other type of kinetic hierarchy model to see if they plot behavior better. I suspect they might in certain cases. I think it's interesting that we can data mine war games we play, also pedagogic games. But we need to do that better, and we need to have a conversation on how we actually do this well. We can, by logging the games, get insight. This is true, and we need to sort of develop, I think, methods to actually sort of understand what those things means. And it's important to sort of differentiate what is the purpose of what you're doing. That's very central always when you play a war game. But I think it's even more important if you're going to try to data mine it with questions, because then if you're not sort of focused with your questions, you're going to basically just get a lot of data that doesn't make any sense to what was going on in the game rooms. So I think the results show that this is an avenue for further attention and research, but unfortunately we haven't managed to make much more progress since we've run these games a couple of years ago. So I thank you for your time, and I'm open for questions. Thank you.